Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. So today I am speaking with a very special guest, and we are delving into the topic of major career transitions. And I mean major career transitions. And with me today is Mike Rataczak. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Paul. It is a delight to be here.
Great. So to give our listeners and our viewers a little bit of context, Mike's career, after completing his MBA at Columbia, he spent his early career in the consulting world with Hay Management Consultants and Accenture on basically a variety of consulting projects around organizational design and implementation and process design and implementation with different industries around the world, basically, right?
That's right.
And then he transitioned into corporate human resources, where he had a number of leadership roles within the fashion industry with leading brands, including Henry Bendel, Victoria's Secret, I think Timberland, and at the end of his career, served as the head of human resources, chief human resource officer for Cole Haan. Right. Before, in 2018, making a major transition where he left the corporate world, launched into an entrepreneurial experience and launched Rataczak Studios. Is that it? Mike Rataczak Studios. Mike Rataczak Studios, which is an interior design firm specializing in residential design. And so that is a massive journey. And I'm excited to talk to you about that process.
Thank you. I'm delighted to talk about it. I'm thrilled that you asked me. So thank you.
Yeah. So I talk with clients regularly, both within obviously my recruiting practice as well as my coaching practice around the idea of transition. And often how people think of transition is within the lane that they know quite often, right? So you see, designers who've worked in corporate design and they decide they're going to go into a design consulting. Or you talk with leaders who go into management consulting. So it's always kind of staying in this lane that
Right.
they absolutely know and have worked in and seems familiar. Your transition was it was a left turn, right?
It certainly was. I blew up everything.
You blew up everything.
When I change, I go big.
There you go. That's it. Go big or go home. So tell me a little bit. Well, I'm interested, first of all, in kind of when you started your career, you took a little bit of a more traditional path, I would call it, right?
That's
So
right.
When you started, what your assumptions were, what you were thinking about there.
Sure. So my initial assumptions were, I don't know what I want to do.
Okay. Like most people, right?
So, I was in my early 20s and my first job out of college was in merchandising for department store chain in New York. And then I transitioned into their corporate HR team because I realized that as much as I thought the merchandising world was very interesting, I myself was wholly disinterested in being a merchant. And so, I'd done all that for about 5 years and I was kind of at a crossroads trying to figure out what I wanted to do next in my life. I was, mid to late 20s around there. And I ended up going to business school because I was sort of starved for more education. I love learning and I lived 10 blocks from one of the best business schools in the country. And I thought, I'm going to take a chance and see if I can get in. And I did. And I ended up going to Columbia for 2 years. Absolutely loved it. I think I'd shocked some of my friends who couldn't understand my interest in business school, but I thought it was the most fascinating things I had ever done. I met some wonderful people. It was just marvelous. Absolutely marvelous.
Excellent.
And when I left, to your point about where my career was going, I wanted to stay kind of adjacent to my initial career in human resources, but something different. Kind of like is exactly what you were talking about earlier. I'm a design consultant. In my case, I worked in HR and I want to be an HR consultant.
Right.
I was fascinated by the idea of how do I use this idea of people in a broad way. And HR consulting work seemed like the way to do that. So in my last year at Columbia, I got the names and phone numbers of, I think, 3 or 4 business school alumni who worked in HR consulting firms in New York.
Mhm.
And, this was the early 90s, pre-internet, and email was crude.
Right.
Called them up on the phone.
Telephone calls,
And
the
I
old-fashioned way.
myself and said, I'm going to be graduating in the spring. I am not calling looking for a job. In fact, I want to interview you because I'm thinking about going into the world in which you were, but I don't know that much about it. So I'd love to come to your office for 30 minutes and just quiz you on what it's like.
And
know?
learn.
And, people love that.
People love that.
When people like to talk about what they're doing. And I think it was 4 people total, 4 different consulting firms. They were wonderful. And, I asked for 30 minutes. I think each conversation lasted a minimum of an hour, almost for an hour and a half. And it really gave me a good sense of what that organization or what that kind of work was like, and proved that, yes, indeed, it was quite fascinating. So long story short, I ended up going to work for the Hay Group, which is an HR-focused consulting firm. They do a lot of compensation consulting, organization design, things like that. And I worked for their New York office for 3 years, primarily around leadership development, recruiting development, things that basically focused on how do we find the strengths that we need employees, how do we recruit for those, how do we train those, that kind of thing. So it was marvelous. I got to travel around the world. I met, I got to work on a variety of organizations.
Sure. Yeah.
It was great.
That's great. That's great. And then you transitioned from consulting into corporate at some point.
What happened is after about 3 years at the Hay Group, I got recruited by what was then Anderson Consulting, but while I was at Accenture. And, Hay had been great. Accenture was just dazzling because of Hay was an organization full of really smart people, and the learning opportunity was tremendous. So I went to work for Accenture for almost 5 years, also doing HR-related consulting or design. Right. So total consulting, almost 8 years.
Okay.
Loved it. But after about 8 years, I found that my personal life was not quite lovely as my professional life. I was on the road a lot.
A lot of travel.
I was getting tired of it. Long story short, I got a phone call from a former colleague and boss who worked at very high level in HR at Victoria's Secret, which is a division of L Brand. I was living in Boston at the time, and she called me and said, I think you need to move back to New York, get out of consulting, and come work with me again. And they were starting this joint venture.
Grab that brass ring, right?
Right. Victoria's Secret was entering into a joint venture with a Japanese beauty company, and they needed someone to be the head of HR for this nascent joint venture. And I thought, when else in my life am I going to get an opportunity like this? And it gave me a chance to also build stability into my personal life. Sure. So I packed up my kit bag and I moved back to New York. And that's really what began the next, 17 years in corporate HR.
That's excellent. Good for you. 17 years in corporate HR, number of different companies, number of different brands.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, and you were kind of going along in this HR function, where did this design piece of you sit at that time?
It fit nowhere in my professional life.
Okay.
But it was always part of me. Well, so I was the only 15-year-old, 16-year-old boy I know who used to corral his parents and say, we got to move all this furniture around.
Okay.
The way the living room set up doesn't make sense. And we got to do this with the bedrooms. And I was fascinated by architecture. And I had one point when I was applying to college, was really seriously thinking about being an architect. I loved it, the design, the ideation of building and how we create and use space. However, 5 years of architecture school focused on things like physics, just my blood run cold. I am not a science guy. I'm fairly built in some things, but science is now my forte. And I was wise enough at 17 to know that wasn't going to make sense. So my instinctive interest has been there as long as I can remember. Always. I would build forts out of sticks when I was a little kid in my grandparents' front yard. And I built houses on our property using old pieces of wood, terrified my mother because they were one step short of falling in on me. The instinct and the desire was always there. And I ended up, as we've just outlined, took a different path professionally. And that professional path was quite wonderful. If I could go back in time, I would do it all over again. What changed, Paula, is that as I got into the mid 20-teens, I started to realize that voice, that design voice, which had been relatively quiet and which I had sort of indulged via just taking care of my own apartment and helping friends with small projects, was getting louder and louder. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. So early 2018, I decided to start looking into seriously listening to that voice.
That's excellent. So I'm curious, as you talk about the experience that you had in fashion, okay, in human resources, you're working around designers a lot.
Yeah.
And you're working with creative people on a very regular basis. You've got this little interest and this little voice, and you're working around all these people who are doing that.
I know.
Did those things ever intersect for you in any way?
You are the only person who has ever seen and figured that out, because a huge part of my life, my last position before going to your design, I was the chief HR officer at Cole Haan,
right,
in New York. And yes, we had many of our designers were literally yards from my office.
Right.
And in my last couple of years in that HRO position, I started hanging out. I would make excuses to go to the design studio.
Go hang out in the design studio.
Oh yeah, hanging out with the designers, and talking to the designers, and just being around that creative energy.
Yeah.
It was like a hit that I needed every day in a good way. And they were great. They indulged me, would show me how they were doing. Said after they got over their terror of why does the head of HR keep coming over here? Should we?
Yes, bothering us, right?
Right. I was like, no, you're fine. I just want to know more about what you do. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was able to sort of live this corporate HR life with a design interest, because I got to work in a creative field. So I still got to be around creative. And then, like I said, in early 2018, I started to realize that I'm tired of visiting the creatives. I want to be.
That's interesting. So it's had kind of percolated.
That's right.
Along the way.
And so I kind of came to an inflection point in early 2018, which was I decided to take the advice that I used to give candidates all the time when I was in HR. And, I interviewed candidates all the time and assessed candidates, and I would coach people on my own team and colleagues and things like that. But one of the things I talked about regularly for years with colleagues, with recruits, even with friends, anyone who was considering making a job change was, to the extent humanly possible, if you're going to go to something new, go to it because it's the right next thing for you, not because you're trying to escape from something else.
Oh, that's fascinating.
If you're trying to escape from something else, the new thing you're going to probably won't work out. You tend to be making a decision in the wrong mindset. And come back to bite you. Now, of course, if the thing you're trying to get away from is abusive or dangerous,
toxic, or yes, right.
Yeah, that's different. But
right.
Talking about I just don't like this job on board, so I'm going to take that next thing over there.
Right.
That generally won't get you where you want to go. And so I realized that I was at the inflection point where I had just had that conversation with myself. And happily, what I realized is I wanted to make the change, not because I was miserable and hurt or whatever you want to say in my current job. It was because the right next thing was in front of me, and it was something wholly different. And that's where I was supposed to be. I loved my 10 years at Cole Haan. They were great to me. I learned a ton. I got to work with a great team of leadership colleagues, and also the people on my own HR team were, magnificent. And if any of them are listening to this, I love you all.
Great.
The best people with whom I ever worked. But it was like a suit that didn't fit anymore.
That's excellent.
I was supposed to be doing something else. And so I decided to look into doing that.
That's excellent. One of the things that I also talk to people about when they're wondering what that next thing is, and you hear people talk a lot about their passion, and they expect it to be this overwhelming thing that they just can't live without. And it actually is, I think, simpler than that. What do you enjoy spending your time doing?
Right.
It's that simple. And if you map that to what you just said, where did you enjoy spending your time? In design.
That's right. And,
designers, yeah.
Exactly. And since I was a child, in fact, there's this idea in the world of psychology, I believe if I read this prior readings correctly, is that if you want to get a sense of what your instinctive interests and passions are, go back and look at what you did as a child. Because children are driven by instincts. They don't have world experience to count on, so they're driven by instinct.
Right. That's true.
So, what were you instinctively drawn to as a child? For example, my brother is a nature artist. Self-taught, magnificent, well-educated, but he has literally been painting animals and birds since he was 3.
Wow.
And my mom very much encouraged this.
Right.
I used to sit, like I said, I would sit in my grandparents' front yard and build little huts out of sticks. And
That's interesting.
So watch children at play to get a sense of what their personalities instinctively are like, what their interests are like. And mine finally came to the forefront and said, it's time
to do this. Was there any moment in life that you can remember, like over that time frame, where this had been percolating, but there was an event or a series of events that said, you got to listen to this voice. It's time to pay attention.
Yeah, there were a few things. They all pretty much happened in late 2017 and early 2018.
Mm-hmm.
In no particular order. It wasn't like one more than the others. It was sort of like they all added up to the push that I...
the tipping point?
Yeah. And one was just, this is more benign, but just sort of like a growing disinterest in what I was doing.
Boredom.
Like I would run out to do an errand from my office and I would be gone for an hour because my office was actually in the Flatiron district, which was near a lot of furniture showrooms. And I started wandering into these showrooms. I'm like, bud, you got to get back to work.
Yeah.
And I started realizing I'm doing this more and more. What does that mean? Number two, I had a very close friend who is like my best friend of 30 years, who just bought this beautiful new house in Washington, D.C. And he said, if you were a designer, I would hire you to do my house.
Wow.
But I need someone who can do this full time, and you obviously can't. So he hired somebody else who did a magnificent job. Mm-hmm. And that really struck me because this is a friend who has very discerning taste, has made a tremendously successful career in finance.
Who knows you
incredibly
well. Yes.
Does not suffer fools gladly. So if he was pressing me for this, that said something. A third thing was more personal. I had a friend from my work days. He worked for the company that had once owned the company I worked for. And I don't mean to bring us down, but he was killed in a skydiving accident on his 50th birthday.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was horrible.
Yeah.
And he was one of those people who just sort of lived life full on. He loved his work. He loved his out of work. Whatever he was in, he gave it his all. Mm-hmm. His relationships, his athletic interests, his intellectual interests, his work. He was the person who had recruited me to this job in the first place. And I found his interest and his passion mesmerizing.
Wow.
He was just fundamentally just a very good, kind man. Like this is someone who, if you thought about the next 30 years of his life, well into his 80s, you could just see that this was someone who would live with full energy, who lived very much in the moment, and very true to who he was. This is someone who just said in a sense that he knew who he was when he was probably 3 and he listened to that voice. He
stayed with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he was killed. And I found myself just thinking, my God, what am I waiting for? Because that had happened to me. And I'm lying there at the end of my days thinking, why didn't I listen to my voice? And so, all these things added up to a snowball that kind of pushed me down the hill to, all right, I need to look into this.
So, wow. Yeah. So a lot of times I think people think there's this one moment, but often when we go through like a major transition or we prepare for a major step, it has been percolating along the way. Right. And it's about paying attention to the signs.
Right before I made the final decision okay, I'm going to make a plan to look into this, I was in a meeting with one of my colleagues who's my company's head of merchandising. And we were going over this presentation she had created around organization design for her team. It was an important conversation and she is tremendous. And all I was thinking about on and off for the hour we were together was, my God, I love the color she used in this deck. And the cover page was this really beautiful, deep, rich maroon.
Oh, that's fabulous.
And all I kept thinking was, I would design a room around that color.
Oh my God, that is hilarious.
I remember what I was wearing. I remember what time of day it was. I remember that presentation. I actually held on to it. Mm-hmm. I lost it. You
remember what the org structure was supposed to look like. Yeah. That's probably lost, right?
And I never went back to it. I was thinking, bud, you need to start a new journey.
So you're starting this new journey.
Right.
But what was the very first step that you remember taking when you said, okay, I'm going to do this? What was step one?
I realized that I know absolutely nothing about the world of design, of interior design, other than the broad strokes.
Okay.
And I need information and I love to learn. And I'm also a big believer in the wise man is the one who acknowledges what was it Socrates?
Doesn't know, sure.
Socrates is the wise man is the one who acknowledges what he doesn't know. I'm a big believer in Socratic thinking. So the first big step for me was thinking, I need to just gather as much information as I can about the realities of this career, not the fantasy that one sees on TV, but the reality of it.
The day-to-day life.
Right. So I called a friend of mine who is an architect in New York, a very talented, extraordinary architect. And I called him and said, take you to lunch, because his office was near mine. And we went to lunch, and I told him what I was thinking and that I needed him to just tell me everything that he knew in his head. And he proceeded to tell me everything he knew about the world, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. And one of the things he said is, you need to get some formal education, and you need to get to work as soon as possible because you are not getting any younger.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought, good point.
Yeah.
And he also said, get your own apartment photographed, start building a portfolio now, and get out there. But he said, if you can get a little formal education, that would be helpful. A lot of people think they can go into this cold, and sometimes they can, but he said, I'm not a huge believer in that.
Yeah. And so you enrolled in school where?
I'm sorry, you cut off for a moment.
Oh, that's okay. So you enrolled in a program, right? So
I did a few things. So fortunately, I lived in New York City, home to the best interior design schools in the country, Parsons and New York School of Interior Design. So I went to both of them and vetted them, and I realized that Parsons kind of fit my needs a little bit better. They had what's called a certificate degree. It's an uncredited thing.
Yep.
It's basically meant for people who are already working. Courses were mostly in the evenings on weekends. It's considered actually adult education, but you can apply the certificate to an associate's degree if you want to get a 2-year degree.
Okay.
And so I signed up for Parsons associate or certificate program. And, I basically started that. And I actually didn't start till the fall of 2018.
You were still working at this point?
Yeah, I was. So what I did is I met with my friend Ted, the architect, in the winter of 2018. And over the next 6 months, I took his advice and I started vetting the schools and looking into them. And I realized the Parsons certificate program probably fit my needs best. The best time to start it would be the upcoming fall. And then I sat down and literally hand wrote on a piece of paper everyone I know who worked in design or design adjacent businesses. So
which was a long list for you at that point.
It was I was fortunate. This is where
those worlds overlap, and you find
this is where it helped to be in my 50s making a change.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I spoke with some over the next 7 months. I went on what Hillary Clinton called a listening tour.
Sure.
Went and talked to friends who were real estate agents. A friend of mine who was a high-end designer/contractor in Los Angeles. I talked to 4 or 5 people, interior designers, some who I already knew, some who friends connected me to. I talked to my architectural planner.
Yes. So you basically went into this process in terms of gathering information about design in the same way that you gathered information about consulting when you started your career. Same skills, same process, different application, right?
That's right.
What were some of the other things that you needed to do or that you did in order to kind of set yourself up on this?
I needed to see a clear path.
Okay.
I was gathering information, but not knowing how I was going to use it.
Okay.
And so I needed to do something with all of that. And what I decided to do was something I really had never done in my life, which was to not worry about it. Usually I'm like, what's the next thing? Mm-hmm. Let me, I can be anxious and worry about anything. Right. Sure. I decided I'm just going to listen to people and see what happens. And in that process, the path started making itself known. And what I realized that I was going to do after talking to all these people was 3 things. One, I would enroll in this 1-year program Parsons started in the fall and get formal education. And happily it was the evenings and weekends. Number 2, I was going to, and this fell into my lap, I was going to do some work as an as-needed intern for a designer in New York City. He had one part-time person who kind of helped him with the administrative side of his business, but he really needed somebody else to help him with design. And he was someone one of the designers I was meeting with. He was a friend of a friend. And in the course of the conversation, he said, I really just help. Do you want to just help out as needed? So yeah, who wouldn't? So I took that on. That made the second thing. And the third thing I realized is I need to stay with my existing job until the early fall, until September or October, just because there were certain milestones I wanted to get through in the job. And I felt like I just needed more time getting my head comfortable with this life change.
Mm-hmm.
So by the fall of 2018, I was enrolled in Parsons. I started working with this designer and I was ready to give my notice at Cole Haan and move on.
Wow. Wow. So when you think back on that, because, obviously in retrospect, you go, I did this, and it all, was linear and all great. I suspect during that time, there were a number of times where you kind of went, wait a minute. And these other little voices maybe came in.
Yes.
To slow you down a little bit.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. What were some of the hurdles you had to get over in that process?
I think the biggest hurdle was self-doubt. Mm. And part of that was just me being insecure about my abilities. I'd never done this in a big way. It's one thing to help a friend pick out a new rug. It's something to make that your career. And number two, I remember talking to one designer recommended to me by a friend, and this designer is quite successful in the Eastern Seaboard. And I knew of him, but didn't know him. I had met him once at a party years earlier. He gave me, 10, 15 minutes on the phone and was really, from beginning to end of the conversation, wholly discouraging of this.
Wow.
In fact, he basically, in so many words, said, you're out of your mind. You are making a big mistake. Everybody thinks this is, you're like Joanna Gaines making pretty on a screen, and you will go bankrupt. Because you need lines of credit with showrooms and things like this. And it was very sobering. And, and it sort of triggered my instinctive insecurities.
Sure.
Right. So I remember walking into that conversation, and that kind of, knocked me down for a while. And that was one thing. Another thing that sort of made me pause and think, I'm not sure, was just leaving the financial security of a regular paycheck. Mm-hmm. And paid insurance, paid healthcare.
Sure, right.
I'm single. I don't have a spouse or partner whose insurance program I can attach to. I had to take care of myself. So I would have to buy my own healthcare, which in New York is not cheap.
Not cheap, right.
Even for one person. So dealing with my own insecurities about, what can I financially risk this? Plus getting this very cold bucket of water from another designer really made me stop and take pause. And then I decided that if I put this down as a balance sheet, assets and liabilities, those were two liabilities. But I realized that those two liabilities, one was coming from one person's point of view who didn't even know.
Didn't know you, sure. Who had also been incredibly successful doing what you wanted to do.
Right. And
so they found a way, right?
Worked for a large design organization that had very deep pocketed clients. So of course, they required massive lines of credit. They're sure that's not where I'm going to be on day one. Right. So it was an apples to oranges comparison. Although I did appreciate his candor, and he made me really think hard about some things. I'm actually very grateful to him because it did make me delve a little bit more closely into, what are the financial aspects of that? And that made my decision sounder. And then the other liability was this idea can I do this or not? I decided, I could. And I started looking at the work that other people did. And I was like, I could do better than that.
There you go.
And I looked at my own apartment and I was like, every time people come to my apartment, they tell me it's so beautiful. And these are people I trust. And so I decided it was time to listen to my instincts. I knew right. And I am a big believer in the power of instinct.
So one of the things, it's interesting, there's a woman who I have studied under named Linda Rossetti, who talks about so much about transitions and how our emotions work really hard when we're trying to go forward in a new way. Our emotions work really hard to pull us back to what we know, and has actually developed a tool to kind of help manage through that so that you're able to kind of see the lessons you're getting from those emotions rather than being stopped by them. It's a tool called Hail. It's phenomenal. I use it. But can you think about thinking back on those times, what was, if there was one emotion more than anything else that kind of kept cropping up, what would you say it was?
Fear of financial bankruptcy.
Fear.
Yeah. Fear of,
Financial bankruptcy.
that was my number one thing. It was, I'm going to go broke and I'm going to move in with my parents and live in my childhood bedroom in my 50s, right?
Right.
My 80-year-old parents are going to stand at the door like, what are you doing here? And why did you quit that well-paying job?
So what practical support did you find to overcome that fear?
Well, I just found it the best thing to do when you're facing an overwhelming fear is to stare it down, like delve into it. There's this, I'll delve back in my English major background, but decades ago, Albert Camus wrote this book called The Myth of Sisyphus.
Mm-hmm.
It has this great line in it that crushing truths perish from being acknowledged, meaning this great fear that is terrifying you falls apart when you confront it.
And when you look at it, when you name it, and when you
That's right.
What her tool is all about exactly that. Name it, look at it, how does it influence, what can you learn from it, the whole,
That's right. And so when I started thinking that way, actually my financial planner became a huge partner for me. We sat down and looked at how much money had I saved. And he said, what you're going to need to do is set up an allowance. Every month, we will give you an allowance from your savings.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had to put together a budget, like how big is that allowance? And, it took me about 11 and a half seconds to realize that monthly allowance was going to be much, much less than I was used to living.
Than your salary.
Like I was going to have to live a different kind of life, but hardly, I wasn't going to be, I didn't have to sell my home. I wasn't changed. And, I was going to be fine.
Right.
The other thing he made me do was put together kind of a 4-year financial projection for the business in terms of just revenue. He said, I don't need balance sheets. We don't even know what that would look like.
Right.
He said, but if you think about how you're starting, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, where do you want to get with your revenues?
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized is that for years 1 and 2, I would live 100% on savings.
Okay.
Year 3, by the end of year 3, I would be living 50% on savings. And by the end of year 4, I would be wholly independent of my savings. And so to race ahead, I was actually wholly independent of my savings by early in year 4. So I was basically 9 months ahead of my
plan. That's awesome. That's excellent. That's excellent. So you put tangible, measurable parameters. First of all, you enlisted help of experts and you put these tangible parameters over what this needed to look like in order for it to work for you.
That's right. That's right. There were 2 things that I had to keep in my mind. One is be conscious that I am not thinking clearly because I'm anxious about this.
That's excellent.
Therefore, number 2, go seek out the input and counsel of people who know me and are credible. Like, I'm not going to go talk to my great aunt who's going to say, oh, follow your aunt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
No, instead I'm going to go talk to my hard-headed financial planner who would say, yeah, you can afford this or no, you can't.
Right.
I'm going to talk to 3 or 4 of my closest friends who will be brutally honest with me and know me well. And also I had hired a career coach who I was working with, and he was tremendous throughout this whole journey and helping me kind of visualize what the future could be. And I still work with him, and he has been just tremendous.
That's excellent. That's excellent. As you kind of went through that, were there any assumptions you had made that kind of looking back, thinking about this, were there assumptions that you had made about what work needed to be for you or what success meant for you or what your future needed to look like that you had to shift or change or rewrite in order to have the courage to take this step?
Yeah, I think the shift I needed to make was I had to let go of the idea that my future was going to involve retirement at 65 and maybe a condo in, Arizona or something like that, or Montana to live in, part of the year and visit my friends and live that sort of life starting at 65, maybe 70. It's hard for me to fathom in any career leaving my work at 60 or even 65. But I had a vision of that my retirement was going to look, that my later life would look like that. And it
Right.
sounds, I apologize. I sound like I'm being shallow. It's all about, condo and travel. But it was this idea of security, that I was in this sort of comfortable life that I had made for myself. And instead I had to acknowledge that what I envisioned, what I saw going forward was something that was much less certain. And that what would carry me through that uncertainty was my belief in my abilities.
It's interesting. You said I had envisioned this, life of retiring. But you also said, and now I can't imagine that I would not be working when I'm 65 or I'm 70.
Yeah.
And when you say that, I'm curious, it's not that you can't envision not working when you're 65 and 70 because you have to. I'm wondering if part of it is because you don't want to.
I don't want to stop working.
Stop working.
Yeah, I really don't. It's funny, and I say that because when I first left Cole Haan in the fall of 2018, after I'd given my notice, I was just going to school. I wasn't doing any design work yet. And I was working with this designer a few hours a week. I had a filled time on my hands all of a sudden. I left Cole Haan and I was going to school, but the homework level was high, but all of a sudden I had a sense of what it might be like to not be working anymore. And I was bored out of my mind.
Oh, interesting.
There are different definitions of happiness in post-work life if you're lucky enough to have a retirement.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized mine is not this. Daily activity matters. And it doesn't have to be work. It can be just sign up as a full-time volunteer or something. But, a life without, I felt like I had a life without purpose all of a sudden. And that's how I wanted to live. The whole point of making this change was to continue the idea of purpose.
And learning and growing.
And that's right, learning and growing. So, once I started getting some traction with the business, I got my first project in early 2019, just a few months after I left my HR career. And over the last few years, I realized I started this career a little late. I was 54.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do this for 20 years.
That's great.
I don't want to stop 7 or 6 years from now when I'm 65. I'm just getting started.
Yeah.
And I don't want to just be retired.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have to be.
Excellent.
So
one of the things I left out in the story of transition was that on top of that, you had lived your life in New York. How long did you live in New York?
I lived there for a total of 32 and a half years.
32 and a half years. And having launched your business and having done projects in New York, you then moved.
I did.
It wasn't enough of a transition. You then packed the whole thing up and moved back home to Minnesota.
To Minneapolis, yeah.
Minneapolis, sure.
I had grown up outside Minneapolis. My family's lived in the state since the 1850s.
Yeah.
Basically farmers in southern Minnesota. But I had moved to New York right after college, and I ended up living there my entire adult life. I lived in Boston. Anyway, I was away from Minnesota for about 36 years. I spent about 3 years in Boston while I was in the East Coast, but almost 33 years of those 36 years were in New York.
We're in New York, yeah.
And in late 2019, when I was 1 year into my new design career, I realized I just don't want to live in New York anymore. Like my old career, this city had become a suit that no longer fit me.
Sure.
Most of my close friends had left by then. Had left New York and moved to different places. Without them, it was a bit of a ghost town. I felt like that guy who stays at the party too long.
Yeah.
And I realized it just didn't fit me anymore. I wanted something a little less much, but still interesting and progressive and engaging. And I decided that I would stay in New York for 2 more years because it's such a great place to learn design.
Sure.
And I planned that come the end of 2021, I would leave New York. So I gave myself 2 more years to stay in New York, and that was great. It gave me a chance to really learn the business. And I got some great project work. And in late 2021, I sold my apartment in New York. And instead of moving to Minneapolis, I actually moved to Washington, D.C. for a year because I wasn't quite ready to quit the East Coast.
Okay.
And D.C. seemed like, a happy medium between my hometown, Minneapolis, and New York. It's this cosmopolitan, interesting, where there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. very intelligent people. If I want to get to New York, it's an easy train rider, whatever. I have some close friends who live here. And so I'm actually in DC right now. And I thought, yeah, this will be the next place.
So it was a step.
In an apartment, I rented an apartment in DC for a year.
Okay. And then
I moved the business there.
And you moved the business there, and then you moved the business to.
And 6 months into my 12-month lease in DC, I realized, yeah, this is not my new home. It's a wonderful city. It's just not my city.
It's just not your city.
But what it did, and this is again the power of instinct. My instincts were, buddy, it's time to leave New York. And moving to DC, listen to those instincts, leaving New York, moving to DC, living in DC gave me kind of just, it quieted down my life.
Space, a little bit of space.
Right. And it gave me some perspective. It got me out of New York. It quieted down everything. It quieted my mind. And it gave me time to consciously think about what is right for me next. And that process made me realize, it was a good friend of mine said, DC, you thought DC was going to be your second long-term marriage. It actually turned out to be your rebound relationship. Where we weren't right for each other, but I will always, appreciate what
You'll always appreciate what you had.
We'll always have Washington. And so by then, I actually have close friends in New York who had moved to Minneapolis, and they hired me to help them with their house in Minneapolis. Their house happened to be in my favorite neighborhood in the city. So that was a delight. And also my mother was ill and getting sicker. And so I was going back more to spend more time with my parents to help out. And so I was spending a lot more time in my hometown and realized this was an epiphany. I could tell you it was Labor Day weekend, 2022. I realized I just want to move home.
Wow.
I was on Cape Cod with some friends, including these clients from Minneapolis. And I remember we were sitting at the beach. And I looked over and I said, I'm moving back to Minneapolis.
You just made the decision.
And they're like, you want to hire a broker? I'm like, I'm going to hire a broker.
That's excellent.
I'm going to buy a house. I want to live in a house again. Before I'd lived in a house since I was 22. So I ended up moving myself and my business to Minneapolis in April of 2023. So just a year ago.
And then you're starting again, right? Whole new community.
Yeah.
Whole new contacts. Right. And what was that? But you were very experienced at this now, right?
Yeah. And
what was that like?
It was a bit daunting. What I had realized, I hadn't consciously thought about, and I think this is important for people contemplating a career change. You have to build up your own business. Is think about the market you're in. You have a base of potential business there just by virtue of your presence there. I've been in New York so long. I knew a lot of people. I never had to market myself. The work kind of started coming. And then I would get referrals from clients. In DC, I had to start over, but I got a project here and a project there. And if I had stayed with it, that would have grown. Even though I had grown up in Minneapolis, I had lived there since, the late 80s. And I had stayed connected to this. I went back frequently during those 30-some years to visit my family. But, my network was on the East Coast. And so I went back to Minneapolis and I realized I'm really starting over.
I got to work it. Yeah.
This is more starting over than New York was, because in New York, I sort of had fertile ground for clients. Here, I had to start all over every possible way.
And how has that worked?
It has generally worked well.
What have you done to make that work?
I decided that I would give myself a year to just start building awareness.
Back on the listening tour. You went back on the listening tour, right?
I got to build awareness.
Yeah.
Because nobody here knows who I am.
Right.
New York they don't care that I'm New York. This is a wholly different world. And it's the Twin Cities are just a marvelous place. It's just on so many fronts. But, I realized I'm really starting over. This is huge. And so I decided the best thing I could do is just, like I said, build awareness. And for me, that meant several things. One, get to know the design community. So, I joined the Minnesota chapter of ASID, American Designers, and started getting involved with them. And I, coincidentally, shortly after I moved to Minneapolis, ASID Minnesota decided to do a designer show house this coming summer. They partnered with a couple that bought one of the old Pillsbury mansions in Minneapolis. And they're going to live in this house and raise their family there. And it's this enormous, beautiful old mansion built around 1910 or so. And they partnered with ASID Minnesota to do a show house. And so I thought, why not? So I applied and I got 2 rooms in that.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah. So that'll be live they'll have open tours the second half of July for about 2.5 weeks. So that hopefully will be some good publicity. But at the same time, I just got to know other designers in Kennedy. I got to know the showroom managers. I was very fortunate. I went to an ASID event in December, a holiday event, and I met the editor-in-chief of Midwest Home Magazine. And they did a digital profile on me on their website in February, and they're doing a spread on my New York City apartment in their May-June issue.
Wow.
Which I'm really excited about.
Sure.
And I also, for the first time since I started this program, I bought advertising. I figured, again, build awareness.
Right.
So I bought print and digital advertising in local channels that people go to.
That's excellent.
And then I just started reconnecting, like I said, I have some New York friends across the street. I reconnected with a couple of college friends who lived there, reconnected with 1 or 2 friends from high school. And I've just got to know my neighbors. And fast forward, 11 months, and I'm going to be in the show house in July. I've gotten to know the design number of members of the design community. I've built a fairly good new community of friends, neighbors. I've got a couple projects going on. One in New York, actually, ironically.
Yeah.
New York City clients for their weekend house on the Isle.
Yeah.
And I've got a new project in Minneapolis, which came out of all this networking. I consciously this sounds so trite, but I gave myself permission to give myself at least a year to just get used to it and to start planting those sprouts. So 11 months, I'm feeling pretty good about things.
So two things I keep hearing from you that come forward in all of the journey that you've had. One is giving yourself space. And you've used that term a couple of times. So you used it just now saying, I gave myself permission to start again in Minneapolis, right? Yeah. And I gave myself space to lay the groundwork I needed in order to do what I needed to do. You've used that a lot. That space, tell me about the value of that.
It's where you find the answers.
Yeah.
And so in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, I think I did what many men and women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. I just kept moving forward, but I didn't necessarily do it with intention.
Right.
Some of it was intentional, some of it was planned. Of course, I wasn't driftwood floating around a river,
right?
Oracle, but I wasn't as intentional in my professional life as, in retrospect, I wish I had been. I was very fortunate that a lot of great things came my way. And I worked really hard. But this new opportunity, I decided this is the time to live with intention. This is the time to really think about what's right, because I've made this huge change. I can't let myself do that carelessly. And and maybe this is just because we get older, we
get wiser.
We get wiser, perhaps more introspective, but I started to realize that the best decisions of my life that I'd ever made were when I made them on instinct.
On instinct.
Friends I chose, some jobs that I chose, my college major, whatever it might be. And the worst decisions I made is when I made them because I thought I was supposed to.
That's so
like, the person you're dating, they're on paper, they sound perfect.
They sound great.
This is exactly who I should be dating. And you realize, wow, we are not suited to each other.
Isn't that so? Yeah. It's so interesting because instinct, like I talk to clients about this a lot. Instinct really comes from within, right? It's That's really right. Paying attention to your inner voice. Yes. Your inner voice, right?
Right.
Which we're not really trained to pay attention to. What we're trained to pay attention to are those outer voices, those assumptions that I talked about earlier about what you're supposed to do or what's supposed to be the next step, and not the inner voice. Where we get the ability to access that is through space, is that space that you talk about and finding that space. But there's so much discomfort in that space because it's a space where you don't have the answer and you have to sit in it and find it, right?
That's exactly right. And sitting quietly, being patient is not my forte. And I think there's a certain societal assumption or an assumption in larger society that that's a good thing. Like smart ones are the ones who are impatient and driven and they just go, go, go. And in some cases that is right. But my answer is, well, it depends on the person.
And the circumstance.
People who are doing it, who are going, are still listening to their instincts. I think what gets you in trouble is when you don't. And look, I also recognize that there are a lot of people who say, look, I'd love to go do something else, but I can't, for whatever reason, financial, familial, whatever it might be. There are a lot of extraordinarily solid reasons that people cannot necessarily choose a profession that might be a better fit for their interests and instincts. One of the things that helped me get to do this was I realized I can. So why on earth would I not? I can. So takes this kind of, and the other thing is, I think about really blowing it up and moving back to the Midwest after starting business on the East Coast. I remember thinking I made this career choice because it was the right next thing for the right next part of my life. The joy and the satisfaction of that is going to be remarkably diluted if I stay in New York and even DC, because I just don't want to live here anymore. I love those. I love DC. Like they said, I'm in DC right now. And I was in New York this past weekend for a friend's birthday party, and I was just euphorically happy to be back there. But
it's not your home anymore.
It's not my home. Right. Being there for 2 days, being here for 3 days. I'm so happy to be back, but I realized these aren't my home. These places aren't my home anymore. But my God, am I lucky that I got to live in them.
That's excellent. I remember, it's interesting, Mike, because you said, I realized I think you said 2021 that it was time to move back. And I remember talking with you before you left Kohan in 2018 and maybe even 2017 about going back to Minnesota.
Yeah.
About wanting to do that and I remember you saying, you probably think I'm crazy. And I was like, no.
It was always percolating.
The seeds, we plant these seeds so often and we don't even realize we've planted them.
Right.
And quite often, the disruption or trying to transition into something, we get pulled back to not paying attention to the seeds that we planted and not paying to those inner voices and how important they are along that journey. So congratulations.
Those comments were my instincts trying to speak up. The other thing I'd say though is I wish I had listened to those instincts more clearly in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, because I would have understood, maybe you want to live back there someday, but not yet. There's a reason, this is one thing. A friend of mine told me this once, probably my late 40s, early 50s. He's like, I'm tired of hearing about Minnesota. There's a reason you're in New York. There's a reason you stayed here.
For now.
He's like, maybe you should start appreciating this a little bit more. He was right. New York, living in New York in my 20s, 30s, 40s, and in my early 50s was exactly the right decision. And I was in Boston for 3 years in the middle of those years, which was also a marvelous place to live. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And my only regret about that is I wish I just sort of recognize the Minnesota comments for that's for you someday, but not now. You are where you're supposed to be right now. And that's a pretty beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. When you think about this journey, which has been amazing, and thank you for sharing it with us. When you think about this, and you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if there's anything else that you wished you knew in your younger days that you know now, and when you wish you had known them, when you wish you were aware of that.
Yeah, I think it's a couple things in no particular order. One is I wish I'd known that I was more adept at the work I was doing than I thought I was.
Yeah.
I think maybe a lot of people feel like that in their occupations. I don't know, but I think there was always a voice in the back of my head that told me on and off for several decades that, you're sort of here by miracle, man. Like, are you really
Do you think you are? Yeah.
All right. A little big for your shoes here. And I wish there are times where I wish to go back to my old younger self and say, you are capable, you are capable, like give yourself credit in a reasonable way, in a humble way.
Mhm.
But give yourself credit. Don't beat yourself up for things you haven't done. And don't beat yourself up for inabilities that don't exist. But also recognize, things you're not very good at, things that aren't right for you, and don't spend time on that. Don't go out. Another thing I wish I'd understood better, I tell myself is, again, what at this point about instinct. Listen to them. They're telling you something.
They are telling you.
They are absolutely telling you something. I've loved the world of design and space creation since I was 4 years old.
Mhm.
My instincts were trying to tell me something.
Mhm.
I will say as an aside, Paul, and I hope this doesn't sidetrack, but I think it's relevant. I cannot emphasize this next point enough. When people are contemplating major transitions, be careful about judging your past life as, wasted time. If
100%.
only I had done this new thing 25 years ago.
Right. Exactly.
That is a one-way ticket to misery.
Sure. Because,
And
yeah, I agree.
I was in a wholly different professional world in those years. Some of those jobs I liked more than others. There was work I did during those 30 years that I didn't really care for, but I did it because I had to pay the bills.
Sure.
I had to take care of myself. But for the most part, they were pretty good. The other thing is that career allowed me to meet some absolutely marvelous people. In one of them, you and I would not be here
That's
if
true.
I had not done that. Like I would
That's
never
true.
have met you. And
That's
you were
true.
such a tremendous mentor to me in my last few years as CHRO. You really were.
Thank you.
And I would never have had that experience of getting to work with you if I had gone a different way. The other thing is I have a marvelous community of friends that I never would have met,
Sure.
who are, so dear to me. I am in the home of a friend I made when I was 25. He's my best friend. We have known each other 25 years old. We are now, 59 and 60.
Had you gone to architect school, you wouldn't have met him.
That's right.
Exactly. Exactly.
When I was applying to college, when I was 17, I looked into going to art schools. I wanted to go to the Rhode Island School of Design or Parsons because my research indicated those were like two of the best art schools out there.
Right.
And I ended up going to a liberal arts college instead and getting a degree in English Lit, which has served me well, frankly. Despite what people may say about English majors, I'm a big proponent of a liberal arts education.
Absolutely. I am.
can discuss it at a later time. However, I didn't go to art school. I
Right.
didn't become a designer. I took a wholly different path, and it led me down a wholly different life than if I had gone to art school. But that different path gave me a tremendous circle of marvelous friends. It gave me a chance to live in this fantastic city. It
Mhm.
gave me a chance to stretch my brain and learn. Through the jobs I had to work in. And on a very personal note, if I had not gone to the college I went to, my brother, who's a year younger than I am, would not have gone to that same school. He came down to visit me his senior of high school when I was a freshman in college, really liked where I was going, liked what he saw. He applied, got in, ended up going there as well.
Mhm.
And that's where he met his wife,
There you go.
right?
Yes, it's so true. It's so easy to have regret. It's so easy to look at something and say, wow, had I not done this. But I always say to people, well, if you hadn't done this, this wouldn't be your life.
Right.
You can't know what you're assuming everything would have been fine because you don't understand the other challenges that you would have encountered from that other decision, right?
My brother and I always got along well growing up, but we had very different interests.
Mhm.
We didn't do many things together. We got along. We just didn't have much in common. Going to college together, we became very close. And, to this day, he's we're still very close. And he married this marvelous person, my lovely sister-in-law, and they've been married. They have 3 children. My sister married my brother's college roommate. My niece and 6 nephews are 7 of those fascinating, marvelous people I've ever met, and they wouldn't exist.
They wouldn't, right? They would not.
Right.
That's right.
So, we make decisions based on what we know at the time.
100%.
So I'm
make the best decision at the time based on what you have.
profoundly grateful for the life I've had. I had some of it was my own hard work, some of it was luck.
Mhm.
So I'm very grateful. So I'd say to any of your listeners, if you think about a career transition, please start with everything you've been doing until now is good.
Mhm. And has led you to the point
Led you to
where you
this.
have the opportunity to question whether that's what you want. And you have all of this experience. I hear you and I hear about the path you went on. And I tell people all the time, the skills that you have are not the job that you do. The skills that you have, the job that you do is the place where you get to utilize the skills that you have. And the skill I hear from you consistently is curiosity and talking with people about what they do and how they do it and what makes them good at it. And all of that is exactly what you utilized in order to launch the career that you have now.
That's exactly right. But this whole idea of like, seek out help. Never be afraid to seek out help because, again, your instincts are telling you you need support for an important thing.
Community.
Like, seek out help. And the other thing I'd say, like I said, I was very fortunate that I'm able to take a work and life path that I did.
Yeah.
And some of the reasons for that were my own good luck. And one thing I'd say again to listeners, whether you're going to stay in the world you're in or you transition to a new line of work or a new way of life, if you encounter people who are trying to do the same thing, younger, older, whatever it might be, if you can help them or mentor them, do it. Because not everyone has this, we are a very unequal world. And some people have more opportunities than others. And if you have opportunities that other people don't have, and you can use yours to help them get to where you want to do the kind of thing you're doing, do it. We have
Pay it forward. Pay it forward.
Yeah. Pay it forward.
It's true.
I moved to New York. I had 11 cents to my name, and people, helped me out. And I was fortunate that I had my family to help me as well. But some people don't have that. So if you can help people in whatever way that looks like, do it.
Yeah.
Have the possibility. And I think in a world where we're so digitally enmeshed these days, we forget the more primal priority of connection to other people.
It's community.
Should be helping mentor and help other people in whatever direction they're trying to go.
Sure. And what's so interesting about that is quite often we're limited in what we think about in terms of the community we have at our disposal. And the recognition that people really do enjoy connecting and helping other people. For every 10 people that you reach out to ask their advice or their direction, 8 of them are going to give you time. Truthfully, if you approach it that way. And I encourage this to people all the time. And it's often those first phone calls that you make to say, hey, I'm thinking about this. I wondered if I could ask for your help. That once you start doing that, you realize that the community that you have is the nucleus of an even broader community that you get to build and you get to evolve. And that in and of itself, just by itself, pays so many dividends to all of us and to everybody who's involved in that process. So, it's true. Right. I agree. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time today on this podcast. You've had a fantastic journey, a lot of changes, a lot of steps along the way, but where you're meant to be at the moment, right? I guess that's the big takeaway. You're where you're meant to be at the moment.
Yeah, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.
That's excellent. Well, I would encourage anybody. I've seen your website and I've seen your work, and it's phenomenal. And I do have some questions for you on that. And on my couch. No.
The artwork behind you is fantastic. So you're on your way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. His website is www.MikeRataczakstudios.com. And if you look at my show notes, you'll see how that's spelled. I encourage you to, first of all, look at his work. It's phenomenal, but also heed his wisdom and insight about what it takes sometimes to get to where you want to get to. Mike, thank you for your time on the podcast and continued success to you.
Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.reidandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's REIDNCO.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.